in relationship to this passage I read in James 4:17, it says, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And it kind of paralyzed me because I started thinking about all these uh, opportunities I've had in my life to do the right thing, but I've chosen, for whatever reason, to do the exact opposite. Um, and here James is defining it as sin. And as you know, the definition of sin in the Bible often is misunderstood because we think of it from the moral act, which is part of sin. So there is the moral concept of it, but there is something that's also way more destructive, which is the separation, which we often don't emphasize because we always think of sin in the context of morals. But part of when we're walking in sin, meaning, and here James is defining it pretty simply by saying, if we don't do what is right, then it's sin. And the question then is, what is the right thing to do? And I think most of us have our conceptions of what is truth, what is right, and what is wrong. And we see this all, I think, in the world today, where we've basically created our concept of God. And so truth and right and all those things become very personal. But here I believe James is talking about something that's absolutely true and that can only come from God. And so the question that I ask myself then is that what is the consequence of me not doing the right thing? And I read this quote a few years ago, and it's always stuck with me. And the quote says, I'm not sure, I can't attribute it to somebody because I don't know who said it. But it said, we're not punished for our sins, we're punished by our sins. And I thought that was a profound statement. And I thought, what does that really mean? And I think what I'm learning is that this statement, I believe, speaks to this profound truth about human nature and the consequences of our actions. It is not, necessarily wrong that it's not necessarily the wrongs that we commit that brings about the suffering. So every one of us has gone through some sort of, addiction or something that we've done in action, and we do pay the consequences of that. But also there's something I think more severe that I know in my own personal life that I've been walking through, and it's the suffering that we experience. And it's what I call, it's the shame and guilt, self-judgment that become attached to our wrong or our sin. So now we're ultimately living this life where we assume that our wrong means that we deserve punishment. But I believe that's a distortion of the truth. And I think that's what the big book's all about, is the fact that every one of us have committed these wrongs, either toward ourselves, towards others, often towards God, because we chose, for whatever reason, to commit the wrong action. But I really believe the thing that I think keeps so many of us from this journey of recovery is this self-judgment, this idea that we are deserving of punishment. And so what happens then is we hide and we run, because that's what shame and guilt tells us. So when James says, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin, I think what James is pointing to here is not only the act of sin itself, but the internal struggle that we face when we ignore the good we're called to do. The inner turmoil, our conscience will often harass us with guilt and regret. That can be, I believe, more damaging than the sin itself. And I see that in so many people's lives, and I've witnessed it in my own life. When I went through recovery, and one of the most challenging component for me was that even though I was receiving so much grace and so much love from everybody around me, I could not, for whatever reason, receive that grace. And so the self-judgment was just ongoing, and the self-talk was like, how could you do this? You messed up. You suck. And we see this also, this dynamic, this story, and John talked about a little bit about this, but in Genesis chapter 2, it's a beautiful picture because Genesis chapter 2 is a picture of innocence. Because they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. That's Genesis 2:25. So Adam and Eve existed in perfect harmony with God, themselves, and each other. So they were free completely from shame, and they didn't have the self-consciousness really. They weren't thinking about themselves. It's really interesting. And I think when sin comes in, that's the first thing that I notice in my life, is that I become too self-conscious. It's all about me. I think everybody's talking about me. I think the world is looking at me, it's judging me. And I think that's part of the struggle of addiction. When we're fueling addiction and we're living in separation, that's what happens, is that we become it's all about us instead of being God conscious. You see, what happens is when I believe when they disobeyed God in chapter 3, it says the eyes of both of them were open and they knew that they were naked. So what they did, they found some fig leaves, and they literally sewed it together, and they covered themselves from what? The shame. So it's interesting because their immediate reaction wasn't punishment from God, but it's shame. And I think that's the thing that I see. And I had this really long conversation with my sister on this weekend. We talked about shame, and she struggled with an illness for almost 10 years, and she couldn't do anything. And the shame was insidious. Like, she could not share it with anybody. And so she couldn't get help. She couldn't get the help she needed. It was until she finally, just gave up and went to her doctor and said, I can't deal with the depression and the anxiety and all these things that I'm working through, that she finally got the help that she needed. So sometimes I think when we commit a sin, we see ourselves in a different way, in a painful light. We feel exposed, and not just physically. They weren't feeling exposed just physically. I believe they were emotionally and spiritually exposed. And for the first time, they were aware of their shortcomings and how inadequate they were. That's what sin is this awareness of how inadequate you are. So the shame didn't come from God. It actually was self-imposed. They literally end up judging themselves. And how many of us spend all our days waking up first thing in the morning, and the first thing we do is we judge ourselves? Like this morning, I had a difficult sleep. I slept with my son, and he's rough. And I had to get up really early at 5 a.m. because I had to drive my son to soccer. And I was just not myself. And I was just being very judgmental towards myself because I wasn't ready. I wasn't doing this. I wasn't doing that. And I thought, wow, why am I judging myself? No one's here to judge me except me. It's so weird. And I think so many people live that way. And God's response is so cool because it wasn't like what we would picture it to be, this instant wrath and judgment, this picture of like an angry God. But the picture is actually, it says that he sought them out, calling, "Where are you?" in Genesis 3:9. And it wasn't like God was angry. It was an attempt to restore the relationship. That God was the first one that was trying to amend the relationship. Like we talk about making amends. It's really interesting here. God was opening that door, an opportunity for an amend to be made. And because of that self-judgment, though, what did they do? They they were hiding. And so they're obviously just like Adam and Eve, we all, I think, experience the natural consequences of our sins, which is being alienated from God. And also that then drives fear and guilt. And God's heart, and that's the story of the entire scriptures, is this idea of God restoring us. And it's really interesting because that restoration process was in motion immediately. So it's like God foreknew in his wisdom that we would commit wrongs and fall short, and that he had already made amends for it, which is so profound, which is so powerful. So imagine us waking up every morning recognizing that if we relapse or whatever that we go through, that God had already planned for that. And there's a restoration in place, and it's immediate with God. It's not like we got to go through. John's been talking a lot about, LifeLab being 17 weeks and this whole idea of LifeLab Express and how originally, the big book wasn't really designed for this. We sometimes, we draw it out. But with God, like restoration is like, the addicts were literally going to people's homes and just showing up, and they're not even themselves like a few days sober or a week sober, and they're sharing this incredible testimony in the story. And I think we add complexity to it because we always have to put ourselves through a bunch of different hoops in order to somehow measure up, because we become, I think, very self-conscious instead of being God conscious. And that's, I think, the invitation that God is giving us here. So instead of wrath, he offers a path of healing and redemption. The idea that each one of us must suffer for our wrongdoing is a lie. It's a lie that we all believe, that somehow we have to be punished. And I was reminded of the story of the adulterous woman who was about to be stoned, because she'd committed this act of wrong, which is adultery. Of course, the men also, but it was the woman that was going to get stoned. And what does Jesus do? The first thing he says is, he without sin cast the first stone, and they all dropped it. That's our conception of how we're supposed to be treated through law. And there's this idea that we must be punished for our wrongdoing. God's antidote is completely the opposite, is restoration. He's always offering us that path to healing, a path to a relationship with him. And that's how we experience, his grace, is when we fail to trust him, that he offers his grace, which is such an extraordinary thing to do, because how many of us have been quote unquote wronged and failed and so forth, so on, and have such a hard time forgiving people. And that's why I think the big book of Alcohol Anonymous highlights the important principle in dealing with this self-imposed suffering. And its solution is making amends. Step 8 and 9. They emphasize the need to make a list of people we've harmed and to make a direct amends wherever possible. For me, that's the area where this passage is speaking to me. It's like, where are the areas where I can bring restoration? How can I bring as much restoration as possible to the people that I've wronged? And also then that's the message that I should be carrying. My life message should be that, to amend wherever something is broken. That's the role that I think we're all being called to play. Because there are people that we obviously have harmed directly, but also there are people that we've harmed indirectly. And this is not just about seeking forgiveness. That's the lesson that I learned, was it wasn't about forgiveness from others. It's about releasing ourselves from the chains of guilt and shame that keep us in prison. It's for ourselves. I'm not doing anybody a favor when I'm making an amends. I'm doing it for me, so that I can finally be released from this mental anguish. Because that's the torture. That's the torture that most people don't understand. It's the torture of having to relive this over and over and over again. And the only way to do it is by making amends. So by acknowledging our wrongs and making amends, we then get reconciled not only to others, but we get reconciled to God. Then we're free from ourselves, from toxic emotions that sin creates. So it's the stupid emotions, the toxic emotion that sin creates that is killing us all. So this is, I think it's the act of amend is the hardest step for me to make, but it's the most profound step. And I believe the reason why it's so hard because the power that is released through it. Because you're free for the first time in your life. I remember John said something really profound one time. He said, you know when you're really truly recovered that you can walk anywhere and you're not afraid to run into anybody. Because that's when you know you're completely free. And many of us can make that statement. So I just believe that when we make an amend, it's a tangible expression of taking responsibility and repairing what was broken and letting go of the weight of guilt that punishes us, I believe, from the inside out. So from this perspective, then, our sin doesn't ever bring about, God's divine wrath and judgment, but it creates a prison of our making. And how many of us are living in prisons of our making? And the good news is just like in the story of Genesis, God is constantly at work restoring us and removing the shame we impose on ourselves and inviting us back into freedom. That's all God is doing. And we're the ones constantly rejecting God's invitation. And how many times do I consistently, and I'm realizing now that every time I reject God's invitation, that's pride. I'm playing the role of God. And what I'm saying is that my sins and my wrongs are too big for him to handle. Imagine that is the worst kind of pride, because what we're doing is we're elevating our sin above God's grace. We're saying our wrong is stronger than God's ability to restore and heal. And so that's the invitation for every one of us today, I believe, is this liberation. That when we're reconciled to God and to people, then we're truly free. And so that's kind of what I'm kind of journeying right now on. And it's affecting because it's making me realize areas in my life where, wow, where are the ones where I've made partial amends? To do the right thing. That's all. So the question this morning I woke up was, what are the things that I have to do that God's given me right now, opportunities to do the right thing? That's my prayer for today. It was like, okay, how many right things can I do today? Imagine living our lives that way, which is now we're being literally fueled by God and love.